A pearl-white Volkswagen Beetle sits on a Disney soundstage in 1968. No badge on the hood, no shield on the trunk, no name anywhere in the script that ties it back to the company that built it. That's not an accident, that's a condition. Volkswagen let Disney use the car, they would not let Disney use the name. No logo, no Wolfsburg crest where a camera could catch it clean. And when the studio wrote scenes where the little car breaks down, sputters, falls apart at the seams for a laugh, Volkswagen's lawyers reportedly showed up, repeatedly, to watch. A car company protecting itself from its own car. 8 years later, Volkswagen would run an ad with a Beetle wearing sunglasses, calling it the movie star. They'd build entire campaigns around the thing they once refused to maim. This is the story of how a company ran from its own future icon and then spent the rest of its history trying to catch up to it. To understand why Volkswagen got nervous, you have to understand what the Beetle already was by 1968. It wasn't obscure, it wasn't struggling. By that year, the Beetle was the best-selling car on Earth. It had been rolling into American driveways since 1949, and by the mid-60s, it had become something closer to folklore than product. The car at the beach with a surfboard strapped to the roof, the car parked at Woodstock, the car that working-class families kept running themselves because parts were cheap and the engine sat right there in the back. Uncomplicated, honest. Doyle Dane Bernbach's Think Small campaign hadn't tried to hide what the Beetle was, it had leaned into it, small, odd-looking, cheap, unglamorous, and turned those into virtues. That campaign is still taught in advertising schools as one of the best ever made. So the Beetle wasn't unloved, it was loved as a category, as a type, as the people's car, a phrase that predates Hollywood, predates Herbie, predates any of this by decades. What it didn't have was a face, a name, an individual identity distinct from the millions of identical cars parked on identical streets. You could love the Beetle the way you love a species. You couldn't yet love one specific Beetle the way you'd love a character. That's the gap. Not fame, individuality. Before a single frame of the Love Bug was shot, Disney needed a car. Not a hero car built to spec, an actual car, chosen the way you'd cast an actor. So they held something close to a casting call. Cars parked in a lot outside the studio, a Toyota, a TVR, a handful of Volvos, an MG, and one pearl-white Volkswagen Beetle. At lunch, producers walked the row and watched what people actually did around each car. Kicked a tire here, grabbed a wheel there, standard stuff. Then they got to the Beetle, and people reached out and touched it, not inspected it, petted it like it was something alive. That reaction decided it. Not horsepower, not styling, not a manufacturer deal. A room full of adults who couldn't help treating one specific car like a pet. Dean Jones, who'd play the Beetle's driver, would later describe the car in 2 words: unpretentious, honest. The same words you'd use for the car itself long before Hollywood got near it. Even the name arrived sideways. Buddy Hackett, playing Jim's friend Tennessee, had an old stand-up bit about a ski instructor named Herbie. Someone in the room remembered it. The car didn't get its name from a boardroom, it got it from a memory of a joke told a decade earlier to a completely different room. Nothing about this was engineered. That's what makes the next part so strange. One Herbie wasn't enough. It never is. Disney built out a fleet for the production. Sources differ on the exact count, ranging from 11 to over 20 depending on who's asked, with Disney's own figure landing higher than most outside estimates. Each car in that fleet was built for one job and one job only. A standard Beetle engine, 1200cc, 40 horsepower, couldn't sell a race scene. So at least one car got a Porsche engine transplanted under the rear decklet, quiet under the bodywork, but doing real work when the camera needed Herbie to actually move like a contender. Other cars in the fleet existed purely for gags. One had doors that could pop open on cue, another was rigged to squirt oil on command. One of the stunt cars, internally numbered Herbie number 10, started life as an ordinary 1957 hardtop Beetle before the production converted its roof to a ragtop, enlarged its rear window, and armored it with a roll cage, skid plates, and heavy-duty shocks so it could absorb the punishment of the film's crash and chase sequences. A special effects foreman who drove it later said it would rattle your bones if you took it too fast. None of this was hidden from the audience out of shame. It's how movie cars have always worked. A single character split across a dozen bodies, each built for a narrow purpose. But it underlines something about the deeper irony of this story. A car built to be plain and identical to millions of others had to be quietly customized, engine swapped, and reinforced before it could convincingly play a version of itself with a personality. The illusion needed real modification. The car it was pretending to be didn't. You'd expect the car's manufacturer to be thrilled. A major studio wants to build a family film around your product, and your product is the star. Volkswagen said, "Fine, but don't say our name." No logo on screen except two blink-and-miss instances, a brake pedal, a keyring, buried so deep in the film that most audiences never notice them at all. In the script itself, the car is never called a Volkswagen, never called a Beetle by brand, just the little car, just Herbie. And the caution didn't stop at the paperwork. The film needed Herbie to misbehave, stall, rattle, fall apart for a sight gag, and reports from the production describe Volkswagen sending people to monitor the script, concerned about how the car would be shown. A company worried its own product might look bad in a children's comedy, driven by a character with a face made entirely out of headlights and a grille. Sit with that for a second. The company that built this car did not trust the story that would end up defining it for the next 50 years. It's the quiet irony sitting at the center of the whole thing. A machine built on cold engineering logic, cheap to produce, easy to fix, deliberately unglamorous, got handed a personality by a room full of strangers who couldn't stop touching it, and the one party with the most disdain from that personality was the last one to believe in it. The Love Bug opened in December 1968 and went wide the following March. It became the highest-grossing live-action Disney film of its era outside Mary Poppins, made on a $5 million budget, pulling in over $50 million domestically. Critics were mixed. Some called it thin, some called it strange. One reviewer joked that Freud would have had opinions about a movie where a man falls in love with his car. None of that mattered. Audiences didn't come for the plot. They came for the car. And Volkswagen noticed. The exact scale of what happened next is where the story needs a caveat, and it's worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. Some accounts put 1968 U.S. Beetle sales at roughly 423,000 units. Others put the number over 560,000. Both figures get attributed at least in part to the Herbie effect. The truth is, the Beetle was already climbing before the film ever released. Untangling Herbie sold cars from the Beetle was already selling isn't something the sales data alone can settle. Reported, not confirmed. What is confirmed is what Volkswagen did next, and that tells you more than any sales chart could. The same company that refused to let its name appear on screen built an entire ad campaign around the film within months of its release. A Beetle wearing oversized sunglasses, copy that read like a studio press release. You are looking at the romantic lead of a big new Hollywood picture. Our car, the movie star. A company doesn't reverse a legal position like that over a rumor. Whatever the real sales number was, Volkswagen believed the film had moved something. And once they believed it, they never let go of it again. Every sequel after the original leaned harder into the Volkswagen name, because by then, hiding the brand had stopped being caution. It had become a wasted opportunity. That reversal is the actual payoff of this story, not a number. A company watching a stranger's affection for its product outperform every decision its own marketing department had made, and quietly, permanently changing its mind. Of the original fleet built for that first film, only a small handful are confirmed to still exist. Commonly cited as 3 of the 11, though as with the build count, exact numbers vary by source depending on how original and surviving get defined. Herbie number 10, the reinforced stunt car, is the best documented survivor. After its film work ended, it went the way a lot of retired movie props do. Parked on the Disney backlot for years, then out on a promotional tour with other studio vehicles, then into the Swigert Car Museum in Pennsylvania. From there, it passed to a VW collector known in enthusiast circles as the Herbie Historian, who eventually sold it in 2016 for $85,000. It lives in Texas today, still makes it out to the occasional car show, and, fittingly for a character built on personality, has its own social media account. Other film cars from across the Herbie franchise have sold for considerably more. A modified Beetle from a later sequel, once displayed at a Las Vegas casino, holds the record as the most expensive Herbie ever sold at auction, over $126,000. The spread between that number and the $85,000 paid for the original 1968 stunt car isn't really about which car is in better condition. It's about which one has the cleanest paper trail connecting it back to the exact moment this all started. That's the pattern with movie cars generally, and it's especially sharp here. The value was never really about the object. It's about how convincingly that object can prove it was there. The association never faded. It didn't stay a 1968 novelty, it became load-bearing. Volkswagen brought Herbie back for Herbie Fully Loaded in 2005, introducing the character to an audience born decades after the original film closed. Heritage marketing for the Beetle still leans on it today. Half a century later, the car nobody wanted associated with a comedy is the reason a huge share of the public can picture a Beetle with a personality at all. And the market for the actual cars, real and replica alike, has never really cooled. That legacy has a real price tag attached now. A stunt Beetle used in Fully Loaded, verifiably tied to the production, sold for roughly £92,000 in 2016, a number with almost nothing to do with the car's mechanical condition and everything to do with documented film lineage. For anyone looking at air-cooled Beetles today, that's the fork in the road. A clean, solid driver-conditioned Beetle from the late 60s is still genuinely attainable. Parts availability remains strong, the mechanical layout is simple enough for a patient owner to learn on, and clubs and registries exist specifically to help verify a car's history and source period-correct components. But a car with a documented, provable tie to the films occupies an entirely different market, priced not on what it drives like, but on what it's connected to. The lesson for a buyer isn't complicated. Know which one you're actually shopping for. One is a great, honest, classic car. The other is a piece of the reversal Volkswagen itself didn't see coming. Volkswagen spent the length of one movie shoot trying to keep its name off a car it was ashamed to be associated with. It spent every year since trying to make sure nobody ever forgot the connection. Companies chase reinvention constantly now. New branding, new campaigns, new ways to seem lovable. Volkswagen already had it. It was sitting in a parking lot in 1968, getting petted by strangers, while the company that built it stood a cautious distance away, waiting to see how the story ended before deciding it wanted any part of it.